Welcome, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Ready for this? Are you ready for this? Have you read the book before we get started? Have you seen the exhibit, and have you read Ms. Taylor's book? You're in for a riot. If you haven't, you're in for a great time. Ms. Taylor, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's get right into some of the questions. One of the things I saw, Ms. Taylor, you mentioned that writing the book was the most difficult thing you've ever done. You did a great job. I read a lot of books. It was the best book I've read since Michelle Obama's Becoming.
Oh, my.
So, yeah, it's a brilliant book. You want to check it out. Let's get right into it. You call it a guide for, have you read Michelle Obama's book? If you need a sequel to that, go get this one. It's a phenomenal book.
Wow.
Awesome, and she'll sign it for you right after we're done.
Yes, I will.
It's a guide for black travelers detailing accommodations, restaurants, and the like, if not black-owned, were welcoming to African-American travelers. For the youngest among us, there are a few young people in the museum today, I hope they're here, who may not be aware of those chapters of our country's history. That last phrase might come as a surprise. Today, it might be hard to think about a business that wouldn't welcome anybody that's ready to spend $1, right? Anybody with $1 today basically can go in anywhere you want to go and spend some money. For the uninitiated, if you would, Ms. Taylor, talk about a world in which the Green Book was, as you mentioned, the Bible of every Negro highway traveler. You literally didn't want to leave home without it. I'm remembering one of the taglines, take the book with you, you may need it. And that was a chilling tagline. So talk about a world where we needed a Green Book.
Right. It was an ominous tagline. And I think in so many ways, the Green Book was because it was in publication for over 3 decades. It started in 1936. It was published in 1967. And it was created by a man named Victor Hugo Green, and Alma Duke Green, his wife. They were an incredible team because they were simply really serving the need for their fellow neighbors and people in Harlem. It was 1935, the Harlem race riot was underway, and there was segregation in Harlem even in the 30s, so this is after, the glorious 1920s where it was the Harlem Renaissance of art and culture, and yet still half the places along 125th Street were segregated. So Victor Green was hanging out with a lot of friends of different races, and he had a Jewish friend who used a travel guide for the Borscht Belt. It was just kind of a kosher guide. And he would travel up north and use it. And Victor thought, well, this would be really good for us. If we had something like this, it would be really great. And that was one of the things that triggered the idea to create a Green Book. And the first guide was just Harlem and a few states in Westchester County. And it just grew from there so quickly because, again, it was so necessary. This was a country and a time when there were thousands of sundown towns all over the country. Sundown towns were white-only communities, and they were white-only on purpose. And they were critical in terms of deciding, what kind of route you would take. And although there was no map of sundown towns, so the Green Book had these safe zones where there were black communities, black entrepreneurs, black businesses. They were centers where people could go, and not only would you get a meal and a place to sleep, you could get your hair done, you could get clothes. There were there were haberdashers and sanitariums and doctors in the Green Book. There were banks. So it was so much more than just a travel guide. It really spoke to how many places in America people were shut out of. Drugstores, if you had run out of your medication, how are you going to get, or if you lost it, your insulin, and you needed it, how would you get some while you were on the road? So it was a critical life-saving guide, and it quickly grew. Within a few years, every state east of the Mississippi River was featured in the Green Book, and then it moved very quickly to the western part of the United States. But one thing I want to mention is the Green Book wasn't the only black travel guide. There were nearly a dozen black travel guides throughout the Jim Crow era and into the 1970s. But the Green Book, the reason why we're talking about it today is because it was one of the few guides that was so well branded and marketed by the genius of Victor Green and Alma Duke Green. He developed these incredible partnerships with Esso gas stations. He also used the Postal Workers Union because he was a postal worker, and that was a segregated union. So a lot of the black postal workers were in the black neighborhoods, and they knew all those business owners. So they would solicit to say, hey, you may want to advertise in this and increase your business, and it was a win-win. So because he was such a master marketer and he had this plan, that's another reason why it grew, and it was in publication for nearly 3 decades. And then also the other guides, just weren't as visually appealing. So he had this great design aesthetic, and he worked with these incredible publishers, and he was really innovative. And so that's why we're talking about it today. And we do have many editions that the Schomburg Center in Harlem has digitized. So if you want to flip through them, you can see 24 editions on the Schomburg's website. If you Google NYPL, New York Public Library, Green Book, you can flip through them, and so that's an incredible resource.
So much of the content is in the exhibit as well. There's so many of the covers are right. It was really fascinating to see the evolution of not just the content, but the design of that publication over the years. Yes. You want to talk about that a little bit while we're here? I was struck by how it changed so radically a couple of times, but most recently with that final issue after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The cover of that 1967 or so edition was so glaringly different. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, it was fascinating, and that always made me laugh because I don't know if you know the one he's talking. It looks like this figure. She looks something like out of Gidget, right? And then she's got this pink magenta. It's like every other cover had green, right? It was the Green Book. And the 1960 edition, you see the first really decidedly looking black young man on the cover. A lot of the other figures are either very light-skinned or, it's kind of Eurocentric. So you see in 1960, it's like Black Power, and he's got the world behind him, globe, and it's very interesting. And then when 67 comes, it's a double-year edition. It's 66, 67. It's, she's in half a ski outfit, like water skiing and snow skiing. And she's, in action, and it's this, carefree, it's really unusual. But, Victor Green dies in 1960, so he doesn't live to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so by 63, that is when Alma Duke Green takes over. She's publisher, editor. It's nearly an all-women publication. We don't know for sure because there's one name on that list that is initials, but everybody else's name is female. So we know it's predominantly female publication. She's takes it over till 63, and then it's given to, as far as we know, we don't know if it was sold. We assume it was given to Melvin Tapley and Langley Waller, who had the New York Amsterdam News fame and had a very strong hold in Harlem. So they take it. So this was their edition, essentially, where it's just this completely different cover. But Victor Green, when he first started the Green Book, I write in the second chapter where he just waltzes down to Midtown from Harlem, which was a big deal at that time for a black man. He's over 6 feet tall. He's very large, just imposing, very meticulously dressed, always to the nines. Both he and Alma were just a beautiful looking couple. And so he walks down there and goes into this Jewish print shop called Gibraltar's. And I interviewed a man, the Glenner family, who ran Gibraltar's. And he remembered him when he was 7 years old. And he says, oh my God, I remember this really large, like distinguished looking black man comes into it just was shocking. Because they say, he wouldn't have been served at the Greek restaurant down the street. So it's like, what is he doing here, And they had no idea that, obviously, what the Green Book was. But they signed up with him, and they published the early editions of the Green Book. And you see a branding of just that green cover with the typeface, and that is like established very early on. And they make a lot of money together. I mean, it's so popular. And then Victor Green leaves them because offset printing comes along where he can have bigger pictures and he can do more. And so Victor Green had the audacity to say, you know, I can do better. I'm going to, you know, they were so sad to see him leave. But that just speaks to who he was, despite all of the challenges and rules, I guess, that society had laid out. He pretty much ignored them. And the tone of the Green Book is so interesting because it's not in this bitter, like, you know, we've been shut out, so we need ours. He was like, oh, I see a way to do this anyway, despite all this drama, despite all the whatever your problem is. You know, he kind of had the blinders on, and the tone of the articles is very much like, this is our country too, this is how we can enjoy it, and let's not even focus on the, you know, on the negative.
Dr. Weber touched on this next question quite a bit, but I'd love to get your perspective on this. Through the years, I'm new to Sacramento, by the way. I was born and raised in Detroit, and have a father from the rural South, deep Mississippi, and we went down every year in the back of a station wagon. So that's part of why that book resonated with me so much. Mm-hmm. There's a perception about California that it's this bastion of liberal politics, and that the West Coast, at least if you're from the Midwest, California, you know, we don't have to worry about the things here that folks back in Detroit had to worry about. Mm-hmm. Just take a look at the exhibit. There's a whole corner of that talks about some of the connections between the Green Book and Sacramento specifically. But I'm wondering, as long as we had you here, could you talk about a little bit about the West Coast and specifically Sacramento's connection to the Green Book?
Yes, absolutely. I think as much as, you know, because I've lived all over the country. I live in New York City now, but I lived in San Francisco for 15 years. I lived in California longer than I've lived anywhere else in my life. So I lived in the Mojave Desert, near Joshua Tree for years. I lived in Los Angeles, and I've experienced, you know, I lived in the South, and I've lived in the Northeast, and I'm from Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. And so when I was really traveling around the country documenting Green Book sites, you know, I always knew, like, racism was everywhere. There was never a place that I felt more or less safe than any other part of the country. And yet, you know, there was this pervasive demonization of the South, of just like, oh, you know, when you go down there, be careful. You know, you got to have extra whatever. And I never understood that because my stepfather, Ron, was from Tennessee, from Memphis. And I felt like there were more black people there, so I felt more safe in a way because there was, like, you know, safety in numbers. But when you look historically at how where that comes from, because the Jim Crow South had the signs, right, black and white, and everybody thought, oh, that's so racist. But what the North did, which was so much more insidious, was had redlining and urban renewal and ways to use infrastructure and use policy to create segregation. In some ways, it was so underhanded. I mean, I write about this, I forget which chapter, but, you know, where they actually built overpasses too low that buses couldn't get through so that black folks couldn't get out to the beaches or to the recreational spots. And to go through that level, you know, where you're building bridges and you're creating, you know, public spaces to shut black folks out. I mean, that to me is much more extreme than putting up a sign saying white and black.
For sure.
You know, and I think that to me was so much more insidious and so much more, because you can't fight something that you can't see, right? Or you can't, it's almost the, what Ron used to call the okey doke, my stepfather, as a Southern term. It's like, you know, they're trying to get around on you because it's like you know what you feel, you know what's right, but you can't prove it. You can't point to it. You can't say that sign is wrong. And so what I found is, you know, when I looked at sundown towns, and I would recommend anybody who wants to know more about sundown towns read James Lowen's book called Sundown Towns. That's where most of my research is from, and we lost him recently, but he was a brilliant historian, the first person to really bring that to the forefront. But there were thousands of sundown towns, mostly in the Midwest and in the Western United States, some in the Northeast for sure too, but for instance, there would be hundreds, over 400 sundown communities and counties in the state of Illinois, and there were maybe a handful in Mississippi. So the thing about the South was that black folks kind of knew where it was okay to be and where it wasn't okay to be. But once they left, especially during the Great Migration, right, the Green Book becomes so much more popular in the 40s and 50s, and this is during the second wave of the Great Migration. You've got 1.5 million black folks during those decades. Ultimately, there were about 6 million people that left the South, fleeing racial terror. But during these 2 decades when the Green Book was really popular, you've got 1.5 million, 2 million black folks leaving the South and thinking, oh, it's going to be a promised land once I get over the Mason-Dixie line. And it was not like that. They learned very quickly that the South had no border, that Jim Crow had no borders, and that ultimately it was even sometimes more dangerous and more anxiety-producing because at least the sign told you where you could be. And when you don't have a sign and you find yourself in the wrong place or you in a sundown town, and you don't even know what that is because you hadn't heard about that in the South, and then all of a sudden you're in a lot of trouble. So, I think it would really bother me that even during my travels of documenting Green Book sites, I would see more Confederate flags in upstate New York than I saw in the whole state of South Carolina. Wow. Or in Washington State. So that's still true today.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit that bordered a sundown town.
Really?
Dearborn, Michigan was run for years
The
by...
8 Mile?
Yeah.
Yep.
8 Mile, and then even on the west side, Dearborn, Michigan had a mayor who was an avowed segregationist. He ran on a platform that was keep Dearborn white. And he was mayor of that city for a good 20 years that overlapped my life. So when I started driving, and my dad, he handed me the keys to that car, and he said, do not have my car or you in the city limits after dark. That was my introduction at 16 to a sundown town. I had no idea what the man was talking about.
Yeah.
Before we go on to the next question, the next prepared question anyway, I've got to ask you this one. As I understand it, as I recall from the book, 49 states were represented in the Green Book with advertising. North Dakota was not. Is there something about North Dakota we need to know before we jump in the car? Because I'm not going to North Dakota based on the Green Book, based on your book. So what do you know about North Dakota that we need to know?
North Dakota, it was crazy. It was actually featured finally, but it was the last state to participate. And even Victor Green, I have some... in Overground Railroad, I have some letters that Victor Green was writing to especially people, even in Montana and that area, where there's just obviously, at that time, probably less than 1% of the people in that state were black. But he would write to them and say, to business owners saying, well, why won't you participate? Why don't you advertise in the Green Book? And they say, oh, we don't want to alienate our white customers, or even though we don't have a problem with black folks, it was this kind of roundabout, but they may not feel so comfortable here, or they may not, and it might make our other customers feel uncomfortable. And, although we support whatever, but we're not going to. So there was this really disturbing language about excuses about why they wouldn't participate. But, again, like I said, I don't think North Dakota is any more racist than any other state in this country. I've been there several times. I've never had problems. But it's very remote, and I think it's just, it's something it's most, especially, well-established white communities say we don't have a problem with race as long as there's no black people. Yeah. And then as soon as there's, talk about Sweden or these other countries, like they don't have, well, it's like wait till people of color show up, and then all of a sudden there's problems. So. Wow. It's kind of, you can't have it both ways. You can't not have people of race and say you don't have, Right. So I think that's part of North Dakota's claim to, we're just going to play ignorance. That
I'm going to jump on Facebook. I want to meet someone from North Dakota so I can say some of my best friends are from North Dakota.
Yeah, right.
In the book, Overground Railroad, you write about the success of the American Civil Rights Movement. You write about it beautifully, by the way. And you write about the paradox of our having lost the very black businesses that supported and uplifted our community back in the day. Can you expound upon that? Because I thought that was a great connection that you made, and one, frankly, I hadn't thought about, that once we kind of achieved, once we, Dr. King talked about he had been to the mountaintop, and see the promised land. Once we got to the promised land, so to speak, so many of those black businesses that had supported us didn't survive. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it was a double-edged sword, right? And so many of us, can recognize, obviously, that integration had to happen. But my stepfather, Ron, would always say, it's the worst thing that ever happened to us as black folks. And I'll give you a snapshot of just say for New Orleans, for example, the Dewdrop Inn was this incredibly popular place. Segregation was illegal, or integration was illegal at the time. And white folks they just wanted to be a part of it. They wanted the music, they wanted the food, and so they would come, and then the cops would shut it down or would arrest all these people because you could not have black and white people in the same establishment. So it became this problem just over and over again. And then the Civil Rights Act passes, and they have to, integrate. And now all the black folks who couldn't go to the French Quarter all of a sudden say, well, I want to go to the French Quarter. And they stop going to the Dewdrop. And then all of these places that were just iconic and were just so famous, during the 50s and 60s, they just by the 70s became completely abandoned. And it is sad. And we have less than 3% of these places that are still operating. So, and about 80% of them are just gone. The buildings aren't even there anymore. And, time moves on and change happens. But what's so devastating is that these were, some of the most established communities with so many black-owned businesses that were thriving in many ways and that were so self-sustaining are now not. And when I had a fellowship at Harvard with Henry Louis Gates, and it was like one of the most incredible times of my life. And I was in this kind of bubble of academia. I was like, oh my God, I just want to think and write, and And then I leave Harvard, and I knew I had a book to turn in. I had, I'd written this proposal, and my manuscript was due, and I could have written a book based on that research and the work I did at the Schomburg. I could have written a book, but I knew once I went to these communities and I saw Detroit and Baltimore and Cleveland and parts of Chicago where 22 people had been shot that weekend I was in there, I thought, I can't write about this history and not contextualize it to today or really examine like what happened to these communities and why. And it's not because black folks didn't want to work as hard. It's because there were specific, strategic, and targeted government policies, state and city, local policies, that shaped these communities in ways that de-investment or, things that were just, obviously through redlining, there was this already established history and why these places were segregated. And yet, despite all that, we still had our own businesses, we still had our own banks, we still had, you look at Tulsa, right, and the anniversary of that was, the Greenwood District was in the Green Book. And you see what happens, but then once the 60s and 70s and the war on drugs comes along, and that's why, my book really brings it all the way up to mass incarceration. We didn't get here by accident. It was a long, targeted and strategic battle that, sometimes we move forward, but we're also kind of losing.
You did a beautiful job of walking me up to my next question. The book actually does a beautiful job of contextualizing, as you just said, history and taking it. It didn't happen in a silo, and we're still seeing some of the ramifications of those old policies today. But you wrote about in the book, there was a passage, several that moved me. One that particularly moved me was you writing about you as a little girl, I believe, seeing an all-black chain gang on the side of the road. You must have been on a road trip. And that segment or section or chapter, I can't recall, concludes with a really stinging editorial about the acceptance of mass incarceration. In the book, you quote Diane McWhirter from her book. That book's called A Dream of Freedom, the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. And she said, you have to deform your conscience to accept something that is clearly wrong. That quote stopped me in my tracks. And then you wrote, I believe this is what we are doing as a nation when we accept mass incarceration. Ms. Taylor, I have waited for weeks to ask you, talk about that, because I was up at 2 in the morning thinking about that connection. You blew my mind with that. Talk about that and walk us through the connection between what you saw as a young girl and the world that you see today.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for saying that. I mean, it has haunted me since I was 7, and I was riding in the front seat of my mother's car, and we were in Houston, Texas, a single mom, you know, I think it was like an old Volkswagen Bug or something. And life wasn't, you know, it was kind of rough, but we were driving to my aunt's house, and they had money. So we were driving all the way across town, and then we passed this, it's called Sugar Land, which were sugar cane fields now, which I think are just suburbs now in Houston, Texas. But when we were driving out there, there were all these men, like in a chain, you know, chained up, working in the fields. And I said to Mom, and I'm just innocently, I said, Mom, I thought slavery was over.
Yeah.
And she was like, it is, honey. I was like, but this looks just like the picture. We just learned about this in school, and this picture looks exactly the same as, you know, what, and I said, how is that possible? And she said, well, you know, and she said, well, they're prisoners. Because I was like, why are they in chains? And she's like, well, they're prisoners. And then I looked again, and I said, well, why are they all black? And she could not explain institutional racism to a 7-year-old. I was ready to have that conversation. But she was, you know, and I don't even think she could even articulate what I was seeing. But to me, through the eyes of a child, it just seemed so clearly like there is a problem. I was like, I don't know what it is. Like, I've just been lied to that slavery is either still happening, but some form of this kind of oppression is clearly, you know, is with us. And I never forgot that. And then, you know, I go and I do my life. And now that I'm, you know, in my 50s, and I look at this and I'm thinking, you know, to me, it's something that always kept me up at night. It's the one thing that just never set right with me. When you look at like your 401ks and all these things that are actually funding the prison industrial complex, and, you know, thankfully Ava DuVernay and others have been bringing this to the forefront. But, you know, when you've got 1970, you've got maybe a couple 100,000 people in jail, or of course Brian Stevenson's incredible work on this subject. And then you look now and we have 2.3 million, I think still 2.3 million folks in jail. And we're just warehousing. I mean, it's just in the, you know, to me, the hardest part of writing this book was I saw when that pendulum of justice would swing forward and when it would swing back. And that's how the book is laid out. So you see decade to decade chronologically how that's happening. So when you get to the present, it's like, okay, how am I going to tie, you know, I could see the thread that the Green Book and the idea of accessibility and opportunity to even just see the country was connected to how can you move forward in a country where you can't even maybe go on vacation, and now you're literally in chains or being put in a cell, and the way that your life is just tragically, I mean, to me, it just never made sense why this was acceptable. And even yet, we see all of these great thinkers and people producing all these amazing works, explaining exactly what's happening to us, and that's why I put the Warder, you know, quote in there. It's like clearly there's something wrong inside of us. Like, how do you see that and say, oh, that's okay for anybody? And, you know, I think, but for the grace of God, you know, because I'm not, you know, I've had so many different people around me or places like it could have been me in jail, and I never would have been able to get financial aid, you know, to go to college. I wouldn't be an author. You know, if I'd just been, my mother did everything she could as a single mom to not raise me in neighborhoods that were so over-policed. But if I had been, and my brother, you know, had run-ins with law enforcement. Ron was in law enforcement. I mean, he was, you know, but he got my brother out of trouble. But if we didn't have those resources,
Ron, your stepdad.
Ron, my stepfather, we would have had the same fate that I see that most black people in this country have to deal with. And the fact that this is just fully accepted as a, part of being black in America, to me, I could never let it go. So I was thankful that I could tie that in, and I'm thankful that, people wouldn't read the book and say, what does Green Book have to do with mass incarceration?
No.
So the fact that it resonated with you
100%.
makes me very,
100%. I'm not exaggerating. It kept me up. That thought kept me up, that we have accepted that.
Yeah.
And having read your brilliant history of the Jim Crow South, you mentioned Brian Stevenson's book. Yours is absolutely on the level of his.
Oh my God.
Brilliant.
Oh, he's my hero.
I've got my first flag that we're almost running out of time. I can't quite believe that myself. You, as brilliant as Overground Railroad is, you've just published a young adults edition of that. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about it. You've got some passages in Overground Railroad that are so powerful yet so graphic. You talk about, you describe a lynching, and I don't want to, this isn't a spoiler, read it for yourself, but you talk about a particular lynching incident that I hadn't heard about that was...
The Mary Turner?
Yeah, crazy powerful.
Yeah.
So given the content of Overground Railroad, I know why you wrote a young adult version, but I know it's just coming out, so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about it.
Yeah,
and why you decided to do it.
Thank you, yes. Well, actually, full disclosure, it was Abrams, my publisher. When I first sold the book to them, it was right after Trump was elected. We were shopping the book proposal around, and it was like my agent said, the response has been rabid. Had we tried to publish it when Barack Obama was president, people would have been like, I don't know if we need this so much,
Wow.
But it was like, oh no, we got it, So I had like a crazy, I had 5 publishers wanting to sign with me, but I chose Abrams because their vision for this material was so innovative, and they wanted to do a children's book from the start. It was a 2-book deal already. So it was really their idea, and I don't have kids because I work too much, and I just never, it wouldn't be fair. I don't even have plants. I mean, I have one, Phyllis. And she's like an elephant palm, and she doesn't need to be watered except for every 2 months. And I'm shocked she's still alive. But
what's her name?
Phyllis. Yeah. She has big hair, too. She's really fabulous. But, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Sorry about that.
But,
I knew she had a name because the way you described her, it's like I talk about my kids. I knew she had a name.
Yeah. So I don't have kids, and I thought, but this to me, originally it was supposed to be for younger. Now the book is for ages 12 and up because I wouldn't take out a lynching photo. And I thought, well, if kids can sit and watch all this crazy violence and play these crazy video games,
Amen.
why can't they see this one photograph that wasn't too, I didn't include the Mary Turner lynching. That's only in the adult version because it is particularly gruesome and horrible. But, I felt like that was my job to edit that out for kids. But this is for ages 12 and up. And I think it's so great because, to me, it's the perfect time in your life to really think about, to learn about racism because you're awkward, your body's changing, things are happening beyond your control. You're really vulnerable. And you all of a sudden care about how you look, and then you realize people are judging you by how you look. And I think it's such an incredibly challenging time that's the time when you can have the most empathy for treating other people fairly and knowing that you wouldn't want to be treated that way. And I think it's the perfect age to learn about this history. And it's not always, Overground Railroad, it's not about how hard it was for black folks. And like the exhibition that, with working with the Smithsonian has been such a gift because it really is about celebrating what we were able to do, the resiliency of black people, despite all the obstacles. So I felt, thank you. Yeah. But finding that balancing act between, not shying away from the hard stuff and not telling the truth, But there were so many times writing Overground Railroad, I just have to push away from my desk and cry, and I'd sing the Fight the Power, Public Enemy. You know, wake up the next day and just be like, go back to it. But it was hard to, sometimes it would weigh too heavily on, because there was a lot of bad stuff. But it's like, where do we find the way where it becomes empowering and that we feel actually, you know, resilient and also more engaged in continuing to fight, because you can get really beaten down by the history. So that, finding that balancing act was really important, and I hope having the young adult version will really be a good opportunity. I'm just starting a 13-city book tour for the young adult book now, so we'll see how it's, you know, perceived in the schools and in the real world. But yeah, it just came out, so I hope we have copies of both, right, to sign. I'm just good. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So you'll see it today.
Until we have 5 minutes, do we have questions from the audience? Any questions?
I have a question. I'm going to show you my face because I am not ashamed. I am the person that said, we saw the movie, and you said, you can see the documentary. What I do want to say is the movie is what brought me here today.
Right. Yeah. Now, we were talking about the Green Book movie, and I think you said it was your son that you wanted to try?
My grandson.
Yeah, your grandson. You know, unfortunately, in the movie, it's only, the Green Book is mentioned like 3 times, and that movie, even though it's called Green Book, is not really about the Green Book. It's a buddy film of some folks, you know, and they travel to the South. But it, you know, to me, yeah, it made it a household name.
Did they get the idea for the film from your book? I was curious about that.
No, because I started the project in 2013. The film came out in like 2017.
Right.
Or 2018. They contacted me in 2017, Universal Studios, because the screening of the film, the first question for the testing was, what is the Green Book? They did all this testing, and they were like, we don't know what the Green Book is. So Universal Studios came out and filmed me talking about the Green Book. And as I guess I'm on a DVD somewhere explaining what it is for those who, so they knew it was an issue. And then my book came out in 2020. So, you know, it was, but I mean, there were plenty of articles and stuff about my project before. So who knows? I think Peter Farrelly, the director, he just said, yeah, he read an article about the Green Book, didn't know such a thing had existed, and decided to name his movie after it.
Nice of him, wasn't it?
Yeah. Which, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're here today, and I'm glad I saw the movie and able to meet you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you're here too. Thank you.
We got a question from the audience. I'm from Chicago, where Herman Roberts founded the black-owned motel chain Roberts Motel and Roberts Show Club. And they want to know, did you encounter that business when you were doing your research in Chicago?
No, that doesn't ring a bell. Although I do have a big database of all the Green Book sites that I've been working on for, I don't know how many, 9 years now. But no, it doesn't ring a bell. If, you know, we would love for you folks, because there's over 10,000 Green Book sites. When I first started this research, Wikipedia said there were 1,500.
Wow.
But they didn't have access to the Schomburg collection of all the 24 editions. So once I did the research at the Schomburg, I was, you know, now I've been still cataloging. But if you go to the website, the Smithsonian website, for this Negro Motors Green Book, for this exhibition, we do have an area where you can submit your stories. And so we'd love to crowdsource that information for folks. So if you do have any, you know, stories or memories, or parents have memories or images, you know, we'd love to archive those for folks.
Really appreciate it. Any other questions before we wrap? I don't know if we got the flexibility to do that, but I feel like, you know, Phil Donahue back in the day. Question, row 3.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. I have a question about some of the Green Book is very much impressive with listings, and unlike some of its contemporaries, which were more kind of descriptive, with like some of the, you know, what to order at a restaurant, or was there any ever conversation that you found in any correspondence that suggested perhaps including some of that, kind of the description of the places, or is it really just always intended to be just the directory list?
And the question, I'm told I got to repeat it for the broadcast, so was there ever an intention to?
Add fuller descriptions of the listings
Got it.
instead of just kind of list as a directory.
So the question is, was there ever an intent on the part of the Green Book to include fuller descriptions of each of those businesses rather than just a directory, address, phone number, contact info?
Yeah, the Green Book actually did have a variation. Sometimes there were just listings. Sometimes there were no addresses. Sometimes there was a P.O. box, which was so odd, where you'd have to write ahead of time. But there were some, you could pay for advertising and give more information. There were ads that were sometimes full-page ads that would have descriptions of the place. They would have photographs of the proprietors. And you see these more in the 60s editions. And after 1956, the Green Book really changes format. Before, they had the beauty shops and all these other places like banks and liquor stores. But then I think people just saw the writing on the wall after Brown versus Board of Education, right, that integration was coming. So by 57, 58, now there's no liquor stores. There's no, it's just a traditional gas, food, lodging kind of travel book. But no, there were many, I think, beyond, I would say even more so than a typical AAA guide, the Green Book, because Victor Green wanted that offset printing opportunity to have more photographs. Yeah, I would encourage you to look through the Schomburg's, the NYPL later editions, and you can see more descriptions about these businesses. The Hampton House, for example, that's featured in the exhibition. They had a full-page ad. Yeah, it was, and we love that because when I'm doing research just on these names, it's so hard to uncover all the, layers of, there's one that has one page, it's just one listing. It's called the 101 Club, the 101 Ranch. And it was a sex club that was in the Green Book, in Harlem.
I started to say, was it in North Dakota?
No. But I thought, oh my God, I stumbled on this, and I thought, and I was at the Schomburg doing fellowship, and I thought, wow, and Count Basie had a song about it, and Billie Holiday hung out there, and it was run by this woman, Hazel Valentine, and she shot her husband. And it's just like a film in this one, but it's just one line in the Green Book, and it's like, my God, there's like over 10,000 of these sites. So yeah, it's been fun doing that kind of research, see what you find.
Well, this event has been fun. Do I speak for everybody? Did you enjoy hearing from Ms. Taylor? I want to thank you for your time, your incredible research, the phenomenal book, and the exhibit. I understand you're going to be greeting folks and signing books before you leave, so take advantage of that opportunity. And let's finally thank the California Museum, can we, for hosting this event?
Thank you for being a great moderator. I appreciate the questions.
No problem at all. My honor. Great honor. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you. Appreciate it.